Okay. So let's go on to verse 3, where he says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So one of the things that we must realize here is that trials will test our faith. That's a given. And James speaks of it here interchangeably, doesn't he? In verse 1, he calls it various trials. In verse 2, verse 3, he calls it the testing of our faith. He uses the terms interchangeably. So we need to realize that trials will test our faith. That's their purpose. I thought about Asaph in Psalm 73. We won't take the time to turn there and look at that extensively, but Asaph struggled with this idea. He looked all around and he saw how the wicked prospered, how they had no pain, they had no problems, it seemed. Everything they did turned out well, and Asaph wasn't seeing that in his own life. Here he was trying to serve God and be faithful, and it said it caused him to stumble. Looking around and seeing the wicked, seeing how they prospered and looking how he struggled, it caused him to stumble. But eventually he gets the right perspective. Eventually he says he goes to the sanctuary of the Lord. He sees the end of the wicked, that they'll be destroyed. And that helped him put things into perspective. So trials will test our faith. And the other thing that we need to realize is we may not always like what the trials reveal. That was the case with Peter, wasn't it? You remember over in Matthew chapter 26, take the time to just turn over there quickly and let's look at a few verses. In Matthew 26, Jesus tells his disciples in around about verse 31 that you're going to fall away because of what's going to happen tonight. You'll all fall away because of me this night. The things that are going to transpire, the things that are going to happen. But you remember what Peter said in verse 33? He says, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Peter, I think, meant that. But Jesus tells him in verse 34, he says, this very night before a rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Peter says, no. In verse 35, he says, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And then all the disciples said the same as well. So Peter was the one who was being vocal and who expressed it first, but all the disciples said the same thing. Well, we skip forward and we know what happens, don't we? They do that very thing. The mob comes to take Jesus away, and the end of verse 56 says, then all the disciples left him and fled. A few verses prior to that, we read about one of the disciples, I believe maybe Luke's account, I don't remember exactly, says that the one who drew his sword was Peter. He struck the ear of the high priest's servant's ear, cut it off. So I think that's Peter showing how he planned to die for the Lord. Peter was going to go down fighting. But when the Lord said, no, put up your sword, that wasn't what Peter had in mind. And so Peter ends up fleeing with the rest of the disciples. And then what do we go on to see? We see that Peter does exactly what the Lord told him he was going to do. He's following on from a distance. He comes up to warm himself by a fire. One of the servant girls said, you were with Jesus the Galilean, and he denied it. I do not know what you're talking about, verse 70. 3 times he does that. The cock crows. I believe, again, it's Luke's account where it says, when the cock crowed, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. If it wasn't bad enough, the cock crowing to remind Peter of what Jesus had said he would do, Jesus turns and he looks at him and he makes eye contact. Just imagine what Peter felt like in that moment, that trial. In chapter 21 of John, before Jesus' ascension, he's already revealed himself twice to the disciples. And Jesus asked him, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? He asked him 3 times. Just like Peter had denied him 3 times, Jesus asked him, do you love me? And we read there that Peter was grieved in verse 17 because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? That's a trial, isn't it? The trial that he had gone through the night of Jesus' being taken away prior to the crucifixion, he didn't do so well. It didn't turn out like he intended for it to. And so it revealed some things that Peter had to take care of. Peter had to fix. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the testing of our faith produces endurance. What is endurance? Well, if you go to the dictionary, I'm looking at the New Oxford American Dictionary definition here. It says the power of suffering patiently a difficult or unpleasant situation or process. Excuse me. That's what endurance is, the power of suffering patiently a difficult or an unpleasant situation or a process. So that is what the testing of our faith, James says, produces. It produces endurance, this ability to patiently endure these difficult times, these trials in our lives. So trials, again, when viewed properly, and how are we supposed to view them properly? We're to count them or consider them a joy. When we view them properly, they can produce endurance. What do we see from Peter? Peter failed the trial initially, didn't he? Didn't turn out the way he wanted it to. Very painful for him. But he learned from it, didn't he? He benefited from it. And what do we see in chapter 1 of Acts? It's Peter who's the one who we see in their gung-ho, ready to go on. They're waiting for the promise in Jerusalem that Jesus had promised to them before he ascended. They're there together, and Peter says, we must pick another to take Judas's place. It's Peter who does that. What do we see in Acts chapter 2? It's Peter who preaches the first gospel sermon. 3,000 souls are added to the church that very day because of the teachings of Peter. What do we see in chapter 3? We see John and Peter healing the beggar. We see Peter preaching his second sermon. We see the Jews getting upset about it. They are arrested in chapter 4. And Peter's not cowering. Peter's not denying the Lord anymore, is he? Peter's saying, you decide whether it's right for us to obey you or whether it's right for us to obey God. Verse 19 of chapter 4, Peter and John answered and said, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. Peter learned. Peter benefited from his trial. And then in chapter 5, all the apostles are again in prison. And again, they're not cowering, are they? They're flogged. And what do? They go on their way rejoicing. So Peter has gained endurance from this trial in his life. But another outcome of trial is when we don't view it properly, is that it can produce apostasy, can't it? Because again, it tests our faith. I think of Judas, Matthew chapter 27. I really don't think, yes, Judas betrayed Jesus for money. Peter betrayed Jesus for his life. But they had two very different outcomes, didn't they? Peter learned from it. Peter gained from it. Judas gave up. Judas was so sorrowful about what happens. We read in chapter 27 in verse 3, when he sees what's going to happen to Jesus, it seems as though, maybe he thought, they'll just arrest him, something, they'll punish him. But, verse 3 says he felt remorse when he saw that he had been condemned to death. He felt remorse. He tries to go back and give the money back to the chief priests and the elders, and they don't want it. And so he throws it into the temple sanctuary, and he goes out and he hangs himself. Very different outcome from a very similar trial. And the same is true of us. That's the absolute worst apostasy. But we see a lot of people today doing that. They're sealing their faith. They take their lives in the midst of trial because they don't think they can go on. And so we have to view trials properly. We have to count them. We have to consider them a joy. We have to realize what they produce for us. They test our faith, yes, but they produce endurance if we will allow them to. And so the important thing is that we never give up. Even if the trial reveals in us that we've still got work to do, like it did for Peter, and we don't like the outcome, we don't like how we don't pass the test. Let's put it that way. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32 says, but remember the former days when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers of those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession, and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. We don't need to give up. We need to realize what trials are. Trials test our faith. We need our faith tested. That's the only way our faith gets stronger. That's the only way our faith is purified. So that's the point I want to make in 1 Peter chapter 1 and what Peter has to say there concerning trial. 1 Peter 1, verse 6, he says, in this you greatly rejoice, the fact that we have an inheritance in heaven, in the verses prior to this one. But he says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And though you have not seen him, you love him, and though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. We don't need to give up. Trials are going to happen. We talked about that last week. It doesn't say if trials, it says when trials. Trials will happen. Trials will test our faith. Trials may reveal something in us we don't like, but we don't give up. We endure. Any questions, any comments on verse 3 before we move on?
Reuben, the English Standard Version, I think a few other translations, instead of endurance, uses the word steadfastness. Mm-hmm. Whenever I see that word, I think about 1 Corinthians 15, and it's really just, as Paul closes out the chapter, it says there, it speaks about steadfastness, but the reason that we can be, the reason that we are to be steadfast and movable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, is that hope, is that everything that we do, every bad thing that we face hinges on the fact that we know, like everybody in Hebrews 11, we haven't received the promise, but we're working towards the promise. Right. So that's how we can count all these things as joy. Right. I mentioned to you that the New English translation says count it nothing but joy. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to count these things as nothing but joy, but we can certainly count all these things as joy, knowing why we're doing it, why we get up in the morning and face everything that we face, because it's hinging on something that we haven't seen in fulfillment, but will be fulfilled if we are steadfast, if we receive that endurance, and if we continue on.
Right. Well said. Very well put. So we have to realize that trial is what gets us there. Trial is what proves us. We're going to talk about being found accepted later in the chapter. In verse 12, it says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved. That's what these trials are. They're testing of us. They're showing what we're made of. And maybe today our faith isn't what it should be, like Peter. But we keep working toward it. And we keep with our eyes toward the prize, our eyes toward the goal. That's what we read in Hebrews chapter 11 concerning Moses. He chose to suffer affliction with God's people rather than the passing pleasures of sin because he was looking to the reward. And so we have to keep our eyes focused there the same way Jesus did in Hebrews chapter 12. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. Verse 4 says, and let endurance. So it doesn't just end with endurance. Trials test our faith. The result of that is endurance, but that's not the end of it. Endurance produces something. Endurance provides a benefit. And he tells us what that is. Let endurance have its perfect result. So what is the result of endurance? He says that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So what's perfect mean? Well, Strong says it's complete in various applications of labor, growth, mental, and moral character. It's completeness. And it's translated in the King James Version as of full age, man, and perfect. And so there we have this idea of we're not a child anymore, but we're an adult. We're not immature anymore, we're mature. That's what perfect means in this sense. Not flawless, like we often use the word perfect. Typically, when I use the word perfect, or I think of the word perfect in modern usage, we're thinking of something that's flawless. That's not the idea being conveyed here. It's completeness. It's like we're a child. We're not strong. We don't know everything we need to know, but we become a man. We become complete, and in that sense, perfect. And then the word complete here, he says it's complete in every part, perfectly sound. Well, we get that idea, don't we? If I'm missing some fingers, or I'm missing a hand, or I'm missing an arm, I'm not perfectly sound, am I? I'm handicapped, or I'm disabled. It limits me in what I can do. But this completes us. It makes us complete in every part, perfectly sound. We've got all the things we need to deal with the trials that are going to continue to come. It's not like we reach a point in life and trials stop, but the way we approach them, the way we handle them in the moment gets better and better, because we see more and more we have that steadfastness, we have that endurance. And then, of course, lacking in nothing, that's pretty clear. There's nothing that we need that we don't have. This is a result of endurance. Let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. So this doesn't happen fully after one trial, does it? This is a continual process. It's not like I was tried yesterday and now I'm perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. I'm hopefully better off than I was yesterday, but I've still got a ways to go. And I think that's true no matter where we are in our lives. Trials test our faith. We learn from it by counting it a joy, by seeing what it is that it produces. Our faith becomes stronger as a result of enduring the trial. And then each time we become more complete by the process. That's what James is talking about here. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. 3 little verses pack a lot of a punch, pack a lot of information that we need to make sure we apply and apply it properly in our lives. Any questions or comments on verses 2 through 4? So we move kind of from the purpose and the benefits of trial here to now verses 5 through 8, I think, how we obtain wisdom in the face of trials. Verse 5, he says, he's just got through saying that you be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. Verse 5 says, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. When we talk here about if any of you lacks wisdom, enduring trials, viewing them properly will ultimately result in us lacking nothing. That's what he just told us. But in the meantime, we need wisdom, don't we? We need wisdom in the face of trial. I think about the lesson that Brother Jonathan brought to us back during the meeting about Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Remember, all these peoples are coming up against them in battle. Verse 3 tells us that he was afraid. He calls a fast. And he says when all the peoples are gathered for this fast, he prays a prayer. And at the conclusion of that prayer in verse 12, he says, we're powerless. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. That's, I believe, what James is expressing here in verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. There's so many times in the face of trial that we don't know what to do. But we shouldn't despair. We shouldn't give up hope. We shouldn't spend all of our time and, give ourselves ulcers trying to figure out what it is we should do. James says we go to God and we ask for wisdom so that we can face our trials. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 6, Peter says, therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. That's, I think, part of turning to God in prayer, isn't it? Realizing we don't know what to do, realizing we don't know what's best. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. We need wisdom to know what to do under trial. We need wisdom to recognize and accept the benefit of trial. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We might refer to this one a time or two more before our study's over. But you remember what's going on here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12? Paul's got a problem. Paul's got a physical ailment. And Paul's recounting here about this physical ailment. And it must be pretty bad because Paul says he goes to God 3 times and asks God to remove it. But now Paul sees, in God's response to him, Paul sees the benefit. Paul sees the purpose of this ailment. He says in verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. I don't think Paul probably knew that in the moment, did he? Paul just knew he had a thorn in the flesh, and it was dragging him down. But now he realizes why, to keep him humble. In verse 8 it says, concerning this I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. And now Paul's response is, that was the Lord's response, my grace is sufficient, power is perfected in weakness. Paul's response is, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul got some wisdom from God, didn't he? God, remove this thorn from me, remove this thorn from me, remove this thorn from me. And God tells him why it's there. It's to keep you from exalting yourself, Paul. And he tells him that his grace is sufficient for him. And he tells them that power is perfected in weakness. This is making Paul weak. And he says power is perfected in weakness. And so Paul comes out of that with a completely different outlook, doesn't he? And he says, most gladly, therefore, I will boast about my weaknesses. Realizing, he says, I'll be well content with weakness and insults and distresses and persecutions and difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And hopefully we've seen that in our own lives at some times. We see that's kind of the story of the Old Testament, isn't it? God would bless his people. God would give his people what they need. He would cause them to prosper. And what would they do? They'd turn their back on it. But when times were bad, when they were struggling, when there were trials and persecutions, what would they do? They turn back to him. And weakness, power is perfected. So we need we need wisdom. We need wisdom to know what to do under trial. We need wisdom to recognize the benefit of trial. And so he says, let him ask God. If you lack wisdom, let him ask God, and it will be given to him. We need to never underestimate the power of prayer. We need to never underestimate God's ability to answer prayer. We see that here in the book of James. We'll talk about it more in the future, but in chapter 4 and in verse 16, I'm sorry, that should be chapter 5, verse 16. It says, therefore confess your sins one to another and pray one for another that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. And then he gives the example in verse 17 of Elijah, what Elijah prayed for and what it accomplished. I think there's a key to prayer that's given to us by John in 2 John chapter 5. He says in verse 14, he says, this is the confidence we have before him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And we know that if he hears us and whatever we ask, we know that we have the request which we have asked from him. What's the key? When we go to God in prayer and we ask, he speaks very confidently here, doesn't he? He says, this is the confidence we have that if we ask anything, he hears us. And if he hears us, we have the request. But there's a conditional statement in there. And that conditional statement is if we ask according to his will. We have God's will recorded for us right here, God's general will. I think the thing that's difficult for us sometimes is we don't necessarily know what God's will is in a specific moment, do we? We know his overarching will, such as Romans 8 says, that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, who are called according to his purpose. That's his will, that things work together for good. But in a specific situation, say I get a diagnosis at the doctor, bad diagnosis. And I go to God and I say, God, I don't want to die, God. I want to be healed. I don't know God's will in that moment. I know that all things work together for good, but what is good in that moment? Maybe God's calling me on home. Maybe by my death, others are going to come to the Lord. We don't know what is good in that moment. But we know the promise that all things work together for good to them that are called, them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. You remember the way Jesus prayed in Gethsemane in Matthew chapter 26, verse 39? If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But he didn't stop there, did he? He said, but not my will, your will be done. That's the way we need to pray. That's the way we need to approach God. And when we do that, we know that he hears us, and we know that we'll receive what we ask of him. That's what John tells us. So we need to always go to God in prayer, whether it's for wisdom or whether it's for any of our other needs. We go to God in prayer. And notice what it says. He says he gives to all generously and without reproach. You know, sometimes humans are stingy. Sometimes somebody may ask us for something and we may give them the least that we can. God's not that way. God gives generously. And if there's a passage that proves it more than John 3:16, I don't know what it is. God so loved the world that he gave what? His only begotten Son. I cannot think of a sacrifice that a father could give that would be worse than giving his child. Worse in the sense of painful. But that's the way God gives, generously. And Romans 5 tells us it was while we were ungodly and while we were sinners and while we were enemies that he did this, that his Son died for us. That's the way God gives. But not only that, it says without reproach. So God does not chide us. God does not taunt us for asking. Sometimes people do. Sometimes they say, well, you know, look who's coming back. Look who needs another favor, you know, and on and on and on. That's the way humans treat us when we ask sometimes for a favor. God does not reproach. He doesn't chide us. He doesn't taunt us. That's what the word reproach, that's what upbraideth means. In Matthew chapter 7, what do we read concerning when we go to God and we ask? That's not the picture that we get of God at all as one who reproacheth. It says, ask, verse 7 of chapter 7, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you'll find. Knock, and it will be open. Everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. What man is there among you whom, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will the Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? He gives generously. He gives without reproach. Let him ask, James says, and it will be given. Any questions, any comments on number 5 before we move to number 6? He says, but he must ask in faith without any doubting. So this is a condition. This is a condition of asking. This is a condition of asking for wisdom, but it's really true of anything we ask of God, that we have to do so without any doubting. That's what faith is. Sometimes, you know, we turn over to Hebrews chapter 11 and we read verse 1 because it says faith is. But to me, verse 1 isn't telling us a definition of faith. Verse 1 is telling us what faith accomplishes. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. When I have faith, that faith acts as my assurance of the things that I'm hoping for. That faith convicts me of the things that I don't see, the creation, the flood, the resurrection. My faith convicts me of that. But what is faith? Well, verse 6 tells us what faith is. It says, without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is. The world's got that part of it. A lot of people in the world have that part of it, that he is, that he exists, that he is the Son of God. But notice what the verse goes on to say, that he is and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. What does the second part of that verse tell us? We've got to trust him. He must believe that he is. He must believe that he rewards those who seek him. That's faith, that's belief, and that's trust. I believe God. I trust him to do what he says he will do. I trust him so that I will obey him when he tells me what it is that I must do. Faith is belief and faith is trust. So there's no room in there, and if I have faith, there's no room in there for doubting because I believe and I trust. So if I truly believe in him and then I also fully trust him, there's no room for doubting that he's going to supply what it is I ask for. In this particular case, it's wisdom. But in Matthew chapter 6, there it's physical need. But seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. Brother Donnie, I think, pointed that out in the Wednesday night study. It's not just seeking the kingdom, but it's also seeking his righteousness. What is righteousness? His word is righteous. His commands are righteous. So if I seek those things first, what does he tell me? I'll have these other things added to me, these other needs. I believe, I have faith, I trust. And so when I ask him, I must ask in faith without any doubting. Because he says the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea. He's driven and tossed by the wind. When we doubt, our trials that we're going through, our fears, they control us. That's what happens when we're doubting. Our fears, the situation that we're going through, it's controlling us, it's affecting us, it's causing us to doubt. Just like wind controls the water. Water of its own cannot do anything. It takes the shape of whatever volume it's in. And it doesn't go anywhere unless there's a path for it to flow. And you think about the water out on the lake, it'll just sit there perfectly placid and still until the wind blows against it and causes it to move. And James uses that picture to describe what we are when we doubt, when we don't trust. He says we're like water driven by the wind, wherever the wind blows it. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 29. Here in the context, most describe this here as miraculous faith, and it certainly may well be. Matthew chapter 14, verse 29. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's another passage I was going to look at. But what do we see here? We see after Jesus feeds the 5,000, he sends his disciples on across the Sea of Galilee, and he catches up with them later. But how does he catch up with them? He does so by walking on the water to the boat. And so they see him coming. They think it's a ghost, just like you and I probably would think it was a ghost if we're out on the middle of the lake and something is walking toward us. But they realize it's Jesus, and Peter says in verse 28, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came toward Jesus. And everything's going well. But then verse 30 says, but seeing the wind, seeing what's going on around him. It's kind of symbolic of the trials in our life, isn't it? We believe in God, but we start paying too much attention to the things that are going on around us, the things that we see. And it says he became frightened and beginning to sink. He cried, Lord Jesus, save me. That's what it is when we doubt. We see the things going on around us and it starts to shake our faith. When we doubt, we fail to measure up to the stature of Christ. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul says there in verse 13, he says, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. When we doubt, we don't measure up to Christ. We don't measure up to the maturity of a man. And he says, as a result, we're no longer children. He says, children are tossed here and there by the waves, carried about by every wind of doctrine. It may be false doctrine, it may be the trials of my life, but those things can cause my faith to be shaken and cause me to lose sight of what's important and cause me to fail. Any questions or comments on verse 6? Verse 7 says, that man ought not to expect that he will achieve anything. What man? The man who doubts. It's rather foolish to express doubt in someone's ability and then at the same time expect them to fulfill our request. Think about how insulting that is. I don't really think you can do this, but if you can, could you do this for me? You remember when Jesus was hanging on the cross? If you're the Son of God, come down and we'll believe you. How insulting. They witnessed all the miracles. But when we doubt God, when we go to God and we ask and then we doubt, we're doing the same thing. We're insulting him. I don't know if he'll really do it or not. But please do it. How insulting that is to God. We ought not to expect that we'll receive anything. And he describes us as a double-minded man. He says we're unstable in all of our ways. Doubt's like having two minds that are in opposition. Imagine if you had two brains and everything you went to do, they were in opposition to one another. That's the image that he puts here. Can you imagine pulling up to a stop sign? One brain saying go left and the other brain saying go right. What do? That's what he says it is when we doubt. We're a double-minded man. He says it makes us unstable in all of our ways. So doubt and uncertainty destabilizes. It undermines. It weakens our faith. It makes us susceptible to error, as we just read in Ephesians chapter 4. But Peter talks about that in 2 Peter chapter 2 as well. How that the false prophets, the false teachers, what do? They entice, they lure the double-minded, the unstable. Why? Because they don't really know, they don't really believe, they doubt. Chapter 3 of Peter deals with that as well. I'm not going to take the time to turn over there because we're out of time. I at least want to get through through this portion. So now verse 9. This is kind of, we move away now from asking for wisdom in trial, and now he talks about the proper view of poverty and wealth. So instead of me trying to rush through this section, I'll stop there and we'll pick up with verse 9 next week, talking about the brother of humble circumstance and the rich man. Any questions or comments on any of the things that we've covered down through verse 8 so far? Yes, sir.
It's interesting, when James says back in verse 2, count it all joy, he uses the word fall, or to be encompassed about with diverse temptations. And as you have, and many people do, I do, you see the similarities between the things that Peter said in 1 Peter 1. Peter says, he talks about those things. He says, where you greatly rejoice, though not for a season, and need be, you are in heaviness through manifold temptations.
Right.
It almost looks like it appears, and have you noticed that it seems like these things, whatever they're going through, although as individuals, it looks like they're all going through it, but they seem to be some pretty serious things that they might be going through. I guess I'm just saying that to show, even in some of the examples you showed, something may be going amiss in our life, and that's enough for us to be derailed. But the things he seems to be, might be describing here, are some pretty serious matters that these people are going through. But it seems to be that I believe Peter writes, and James writes virtually around the same time period. I guess what I'm saying is it puts in perspective kind of the times that we live in, which are rather peaceful,
right?
And maybe when you read the Bible, a lot of times you don't think, you don't look at maybe some of the difficult circumstances that Christians were suffering during that time, during the first century.
Yeah, that's right.
Make a proper comparison,
Right.
So it makes you see, what little things might just hinder us from doing what's right. What's going to make you just fall and forget, leave the faith. Something small, a war, which really, in comparison to life, to heaven, it's a small thing, but smaller things than that cause us to turn away.
That's a good point. Most of what we read in the scriptures is a result of persecution. The seizing of their property, all these things was a result of persecution because of their belief. Most of us are not going through that kind of persecution. And that's a wonderful thing, but as Jeremy says, it ought to help put into perspective when we do go through trials, that by comparison, they're fairly small. They're really small compared to the things that men like Paul went through. And so that ought to boost our faith. That ought to help us be more steadfast, realizing what they went through and what they were able to endure versus what we're going through and what we have to endure. So I appreciate that. All right, we'll pick up with verse 9 next week. Thanks for the comments.